Hey guys, waking up freezing in the Middle Ages was not just a matter of bad weather or thin blankets. The stranger truth is that cold lived inside the home itself, in the walls, in the floor, in the bedding, in the smoke, and in the daily routines people had to accept before the sun had properly risen. Tell me where you're watching from and what part of history you'd like to fall asleep to next. If you enjoy thoughtful long-form history, a like is a simple way to support this kind of work. And if you want more calm, quietly fascinating history, you're very welcome to subscribe. So tonight, we begin in a medieval room before dawn, when the first feeling of the day was not light, but cold. For many people in medieval Europe, especially in the colder months, waking was not a clean and comfortable transition from sleep into morning. It was often slow, reluctant, and physical. Before the mind had time to form a prayer, a task, or a worry, the body already knew the truth of the room. The air was sharp. The bedding had lost what little warmth it had stored. Breath might feel visible or almost visible in the gloom. The rushes on the floor held the night's chill. Stone, timber, and packed earth did not forgive the cold easily. Modern viewers often imagine medieval winter as something outside the house. Snow on fields, frost on roads, icy wind moving between bare trees. But for ordinary people, the more intimate discomfort was that the outside world was never fully kept outside. Walls were barriers, but not sealed ones. Roofs covered, but they did not always insulate. Windows admitted light, but they also admitted drafts. Doors closed, but wind found the gaps. A medieval home could shelter a family from the worst of the weather and still remain cold enough that waking up felt like returning to hardship before the day had even begun. This is one of the first things to understand if we want to treat the past honestly. Medieval people were not foolish for living this way, and they were not simply tougher versions of ourselves. They lived within the materials, money, fuels, customs, and technologies available to them. Their choices often made practical sense inside their world. But practical did not always mean comfortable. A room could be reasonable by medieval standards and miserable by modern ones. A bed could be valuable, even cherished, and still leave the person inside it shivering before morning. The exact experience depended heavily on place, wealth, season, and household. A noble family in a well-built hall did not wake like a poor laborer in a damp cottage. A town artisan with a hearth and a crowded room did not wake exactly like a shepherd, a servant, or a field worker sleeping close to animals. A monastery, a manor, a peasant home, and an urban lodging all had different rhythms. But across much of northern and western Europe, from the high Middle Ages into the late medieval period, winter cold was a shared pressure, shaping not only comfort, but work, health, sleep, family life, and even the feeling of time itself. The day often began before the home felt ready for human movement. In winter, light came late. Work, however, could not always wait for comfort. Animals needed attention. Fires had to be stirred or remade. Water might need to be fetched. Bread, pottage, tools, cloth, carts, fields, ovens, workshops, and markets all pulled people out of whatever warmth they had managed to gather overnight. For many households, the morning was not a peaceful beginning. It was a negotiation between cold, duty, and the small hope that movement would create warmth faster than the hearth could. The bed itself deserves attention, because it was one of the most important places where medieval people tried to resist the cold. Today, a bed is often treated as private furniture, personal and soft, a place separated from the labor of the day. In the Middle Ages, a bed could be a major possession, sometimes among the most valuable items in a household. But for the poor, bedding might be simple. Straw, sacks, rough wool, cloaks, old coverings, or shared sleeping spaces. Even when a bedstead existed, the comfort depended on what could be placed on it, what could be hung around it, and how many bodies could share the warmth. Sharing a bed was not always a sign of affection in the modern sense. Often it was practical. Bodies produced heat. Families crowded together because space was scarce and fuel was costly. Servants might sleep in shared quarters. Children slept near adults. Travelers shared lodgings. In poorer homes, privacy was less important than survival, convenience, and custom. To a modern listener, the lack of privacy may feel uncomfortable, but in a freezing room, another person nearby could be part of the household's defense against the night. And yet, even shared warmth had limits. Wool could keep heat better than linen, but good wool cost money. Furs were warmer, but they were not ordinary bedding for most people. Straw could cushion the body, but it could also flatten, dampen, or harbor pests. Curtains around a bed, when available, could reduce drafts, which is one reason enclosed beds and hangings mattered. They were not only decorative. They created a smaller climate inside a larger cold space. In wealthier homes, bed curtains could turn a sleeping place into a chamber of trapped warmth. For poorer households, the same principle appeared in simpler form. Sleeping close, using cloaks, keeping near the hearth, or blocking drafts with whatever materials could be managed. The hearth was the emotional and practical center of many medieval homes, but it is easy to overestimate how well it heated a building. Fire gave light, heat, and a place to cook. It was necessary, almost companion-like in winter, but an open hearth did not behave like a modern heating system. Much warmth escaped upward. Smoke could linger. Heat was strongest near the flame and weaker at the edges of the room. If the fire burned low during the night, the house cooled steadily. Keeping a strong fire through the whole night required fuel, and fuel required labor, land rights, money, or time. This is one of the quieter truths behind medieval cold. Warmth was work. It was not simply something a household had. It had to be gathered, chopped, carried, stored, guarded, and rationed. Wood was valuable. In many regions, access to woodland was regulated by custom, lordship, or local rights. People gathered fallen branches, cut fuel where permitted, bought firewood if they could, or used other materials when necessary. In some places, peat, turf, brushwood, straw, or dried animal dung might serve as fuel. None of this was effortless. Before warmth reached the body, someone had already spent energy making it possible. So when a person woke freezing, the cold was not just weather pressing on the skin. It was also economics. It was land use. It was social hierarchy. It was the household's available labor. A richer family could afford more fuel, better construction, thicker textiles, more enclosed sleeping spaces, and servants to manage the fire. A poorer family might endure the cold longer, burn less, wake earlier, and make hard decisions about when to use fuel and when to save it. Comfort was never evenly distributed. The design of the house mattered too. Many rural homes were built from materials close at hand: timber, wattle and daub, thatch, clay, stone where available, packed earth floors, and simple wooden frames. These materials could create sturdy shelter, but insulation varied widely. A thatched roof could offer some protection, but damp, gaps, aging materials, and poor maintenance made a difference. Earthen floors held cold and moisture. Stone walls, impressive as they might seem, could remain bitterly cold. Small windows helped reduce heat loss, but they also limited light. Shutters might close against the weather, yet darkness deepened the sense of enclosure. In towns, the story changed but did not become simple. Urban homes and workshops were often crowded, multi-purpose spaces where people lived, worked, stored goods, cooked, and slept in close quarters. Crowding could produce warmth, but it also meant smoke, smells, noise, and a lack of restfulness. A freezing morning in a town might come with the sounds of neighbors, animals, carts, apprentices, bells, and trade beginning before the streets were fully bright. The cold was not silent. It belonged to a whole waking world. For a laborer, the first movements of the day could be unpleasantly immediate. Leaving bedding meant losing the one small pocket of heat the body had created overnight. Feet touched a cold floor. Hands searched for clothing that might itself be chilled. Linen underclothes, woolen outer garments, hose, tunics, cloaks, hoods, and shoes all mattered, but getting dressed in cold air could be its own discomfort. Clothing was not merely fashion. It was a portable wall between the person and the weather. Layers were vital. Wool was especially important because it could retain warmth better than many alternatives, and it remained useful even when conditions were damp. Still, clothing did not erase the cold. Medieval garments could be warm, but they were not modern winter gear. Closures, seams, worn fabric, dampness, and poverty all affected how well clothing protected the body. A person might sleep partly clothed in cold weather, not because they lacked manners, but because undressing fully could be unwise. Nightcaps, hoods, wrapped cloth, cloaks, and coverings helped preserve heat. The head and hands were especially vulnerable in a cold room. Small habits, repeated over generations, formed a practical knowledge of survival. Keep the draft from the neck, stay near others, rise quickly once you must rise, and do not waste the little heat you have. One of the common misunderstandings about medieval people is that they simply accepted discomfort without noticing it. The surviving record does not support such a simple view. People complained about cold. They prepared for it. They feared harsh winters. They measured seasons through hardship as well as through church calendars and agricultural cycles. Cold damaged crops, killed animals, froze roads, slowed trade, and made illness more dangerous. It entered sermons, accounts, household management, poetry, and memory. Medieval people may have expected cold more than we do, but expectation is not the same as comfort. For peasants and rural workers, winter mornings also connected the home to the field. Even when heavy fieldwork slowed in the coldest months, labor did not stop. Animals needed feeding. Tools needed repair. Hedges, wood, fences, carts, barns, and stores required attention. Women's labor within the household could be relentless. Food preparation, child care, textile work, brewing, tending fires, managing small animals, and keeping the home functioning. Cold did not pause these tasks. It made them harder, slower, and more tiring. There was also the problem of damp. A cold, dry room is uncomfortable, but a cold, damp room carries a different kind of misery. Damp bedding, damp clothes, damp floors, and damp walls could make the chill feel as though it had weight. In many medieval regions, winter was not only snowy or icy, but wet. Rain, mud, fog, leaking roofs, soaked roads, and moisture rising from the ground. Wet wool could still protect better than many fabrics, but it was heavy and unpleasant. Shoes could become stiff or worn. Feet stayed cold. Drying clothing indoors near a smoky hearth took time, space, and fuel. This is where the image of the romantic medieval cottage begins to break apart. A glowing fire in a dark room can look beautiful from a distance, but inside that room, the glow came with smoke, labor, damp, crowding, and the constant need to keep the fire alive. The hearth gave life, but it also demanded attention. Ash had to be managed. Sparks had to be watched. Fuel had to be conserved. Smoke could irritate eyes and throats. Chimneys became more common over time in certain places and among better-off households. But for many ordinary medieval homes, smoke and warmth were closely linked. The morning cold was especially severe because the household had passed through the long hours when no one wanted to rise and feed the fire. If embers survived, they were precious. A skilled household could bank a fire, preserving coals beneath ash so it could be revived in the morning. This small act could change the first hour of the day. If the fire had gone out completely, relighting it could be more difficult. Flint, steel, tinder, dry material, and patience were needed. In a damp winter, even making fire could remind a person how dependent human comfort was on fragile conditions. For those who lived in great houses, castles, and monasteries, the cold was different but not absent. Large stone buildings could be impressive, defensive, and symbolically powerful, yet they were often difficult to heat. Great halls had large fires, but heat dispersed into vast spaces. Private chambers, wall hangings, tapestries, rugs, wooden paneling, and enclosed beds helped soften the cold for the wealthy. These were not only luxuries of display, they were technologies of comfort. A tapestry was art, but it was also insulation. A smaller chamber was status, but it was also warmer than a cavernous hall. Even kings and nobles felt winter. They simply had more ways to fight it. They could move between residences. They could command fuel, servants, textiles, and builders. They could sleep in better bedding, wear lined garments, and gather around better-managed fires. But a castle in winter was not a modern hotel with central heating hidden behind the walls. The noble body still knew cold corridors, cold chapels, cold stone, and the value of a brazier or a warmed bed. Wealth narrowed the distance between human beings and comfort, but it did not erase the season. Monastic life adds another layer. Monks and nuns lived by rules that shaped sleeping, waking, prayer, and discipline. Night offices could require rising in darkness and cold to pray. The discomfort of cold could be interpreted spiritually, as part of discipline, humility, or endurance. Yet monasteries were also practical institutions. They needed warmth, food, storage, clothing, and health. The tension between bodily discomfort and spiritual purpose gave medieval winter a meaning that modern comfort rarely carries. Cold was not only a nuisance, it could become part of moral life, religious rhythm, and the ordering of the day. For ordinary laypeople, religion also shaped the experience of waking. The first thoughts of morning might include prayer, saints, obligations, fears, and the calendar of feast days and fasts. Bells marked time in many communities. The church year gave structure to winter, placing Christmas, Candlemas, Lent, and local observances within the cold season. But the body still had to get out of bed. The spiritual and the physical were not separate worlds. A person could mutter a prayer while reaching for cold clothing, cross themselves beside a smoky hearth, or begin the day with both devotion and discomfort. What makes this topic so quietly powerful is that waking cold reveals the Middle Ages at the level of the body. Many histories begin with kings, battles, laws, or plagues. Those matter. But daily cold shows us the basic conditions underneath everything else. Before a farmer paid rent, before an apprentice opened a workshop, before a servant prepared a noble household, before a monk sang in the dark, there was the simple fact of leaving warmth behind. History was lived through skin, breath, fingers, feet, and tired muscles. And the cold did not affect everyone equally. Age mattered. Infants, the elderly, the sick, and the underfed were more vulnerable. Nutrition shaped resilience. A body with enough food could endure cold better than a body already weakened. Medieval diets varied by class, region, and season, but winter often tested stored supplies. Grain, ale, pottage, salted meat, cheese, legumes, roots, and preserved foods might sustain a household, but shortages and price rises could turn cold into danger. Warmth and food worked together. Without enough of either, the morning became harder to survive well. This connection between cold and food is easy to miss. A hot meal or warm drink could transform the beginning of a day. Pottage simmering near the fire, ale warmed or consumed as part of daily nourishment, bread dipped into something warm, or leftovers heated when fuel allowed. These were not minor comforts. They were forms of bodily recovery. Yet preparing warmth required warmth. Cooking required fuel. Fuel required resources. The household was a chain of dependencies, and winter exposed every weak link. There is also a reason medieval people often organized life around shared spaces. Modern comfort prizes separate bedrooms, individual schedules, quiet heating, and private routines. Medieval survival often rewarded closeness. A crowded room could be noisy and uncomfortable, but it was warmer than isolation. Animals kept near human spaces could add smells and disorder, yet they also represented wealth, food, labor, and sometimes heat. A household was not a set of private zones. It was a working organism, and in winter that organism contracted around warmth. Still, closeness had its costs. Sleep could be broken by coughing, crying children, animals shifting, neighbors moving, wind rattling shutters, or someone rising early to tend the fire. If bedding carried fleas or lice, rest became even less restful. If smoke lingered, eyes and throats suffered. If someone was ill, everyone nearby knew it. A freezing morning might follow a night that had never truly felt peaceful. So the misery was not simply that people woke cold. It was that many woke cold after poor sleep, in rooms where the body had been resting but not fully recovering. This is an important expectation reversal. Medieval people did not always lack rest because they worked every minute. They often lacked restoration because rest itself was uncomfortable. A winter night might remove a person from labor without giving back strength. The body lay still, but it did not necessarily feel safe, warm, clean, or alone. And when dawn finally came, the first duty was often to rebuild the conditions that made life bearable. Revive the fire, prepare food, manage animals, dress children, gather water, and step into a world that was colder than the bed but no less demanding. The landscape beyond the door could be beautiful, but beauty did not make it kind. Frost on fields meant hard ground. Snow could hide paths. Mud could swallow shoes and cart wheels. Frozen water complicated washing, cooking, brewing, and watering animals. Roads became slower. Markets became harder to reach. Travelers risked exposure. A person waking in a medieval village did not simply ask, "Is it cold?" They lived inside a network of consequences. Can we get water? Can the animals be fed? Can the path be walked? Can the roof hold? Can the firewood last? And yet people adapted with remarkable intelligence. They layered clothing, built routines, preserved food, shared spaces, maintained fires, used textiles strategically, repaired homes seasonally, and organized labor around daylight and weather. Their world was uncomfortable, but it was not random. It had patterns. It had skills. It had inherited knowledge. A modern person dropped into that world might notice only the suffering at first. A medieval person noticed the difference between a good thatch and a failing one, between dry fuel and damp fuel, between a well-banked hearth and a dead fire, between a bed placed wisely and one ruined by drafts. That practical intelligence is one reason we should be careful when judging the past. The Middle Ages were not a single dark room filled with helpless people. They were centuries of adaptation under constraint. People made warmth from what they had. They created customs around sleeping, working, eating, praying, storing, and sharing. They understood their houses not as sealed machines, but as living structures that had to be tended. A home needed maintenance the way a fire needed feeding. As the morning advanced, cold began to change character. At first, it was the enemy of rising. Then it became the force that hurried movement. People dressed faster, worked closer to the hearth, stepped outside with purpose, and used labor itself as heat. In some ways, work was warmer than rest. A person carrying wood, kneading dough, mucking out an animal space, walking to a field, turning a spindle, hammering in a workshop, or sweeping a floor might slowly regain feeling in the hands and feet. The irony was sharp but ordinary. The body escaped the cold of sleep by entering the cold of labor. This rhythm shaped the emotional texture of winter. Morning was not only a beginning, it was a small test repeated day after day. Could the household make itself warm enough? Could stored supplies hold? Could the old survive until spring? Could animals be kept alive? Could work continue? Could sickness be avoided? The medieval year was not an abstract calendar. It was a cycle of pressures felt in the bones. And from here, the story becomes even more revealing, because waking up freezing was only the first moment. What happened next depended on the kind of home a person lived in, the work waiting outside, the fuel they could access, and the small domestic strategies that separated discomfort from real danger. To understand that world more fully, we have to move closer to the hearth itself, into the smoke, the bedding, the morning chores, and the strange ways medieval people tried to build warmth in a world that kept taking it away. To move closer to the hearth is to move toward the center of medieval domestic life, but also toward one of its great contradictions. The fire was the source of warmth, food, light, and comfort, yet it was rarely as gentle or generous as modern imagination makes it seem. It did not fill a room evenly. It did not wait quietly behind a thermostat. It had to be coaxed, guarded, fed, and endured. A family waking in the cold did not simply enjoy the hearth. They entered into a daily relationship with it, one shaped by smoke, fuel, timing, labor, and the constant fear that warmth might not last as long as the weather did. In a poorer rural home, the hearth might be little more than a prepared place on the floor, sometimes with stones around it, sometimes positioned beneath a smoke hole or under a roof space where smoke could drift upward and escape imperfectly. In better houses, fireplaces and chimneys gradually changed the experience, but that transformation was uneven. The popular picture of a neat medieval fireplace, glowing in a clean stone wall, belongs more naturally to certain wealthier homes and later developments than to every cottage or workshop. For many ordinary people, fire was open, smoky, and close to the body. It warmed one side while the other remained cold. This mattered most in the first part of the morning. If embers had survived the night, someone had to kneel near the ashes, disturb them carefully, and search for the small red life beneath the gray. That moment could decide the mood of the household. Living embers meant a quicker start. Tinder could catch, kindling could be laid, and the room might begin to soften before hands went numb. Dead ashes meant delay. In winter, delay had weight. The person responsible for the fire might have to strike sparks, find dry tinder, blow gently into smoke, and wait as fragile flame tried to become heat. It is easy to forget how much patience fire demanded. Modern heat arrives invisibly, often without ceremony. Medieval warmth was visible and uncertain. It had stages. A spark was not a fire. A flame was not yet a cooking fire. A cooking fire was not always enough to heat a room. Damp wood smoked before it burned well. Green wood resisted. Small twigs caught quickly but vanished quickly. Larger logs lasted longer but needed a fire already strong enough to take them. A household's warmth was built by sequence, judgment, and experience. And the person tending it was not always the strongest adult man of the house. Very often, the early domestic management of heat belonged to women, servants, older children, or whoever's place in the household required rising first. The work of warmth was woven into the work of food. A fire was needed to heat pottage, bake on a griddle, warm water, revive leftovers, dry clothing, and make the room tolerable for others. Before the household could appear alive from the outside, Someone inside had already begun this quiet labor. The smoke itself created another kind of discomfort. In houses without efficient chimneys, smoke did not simply disappear. It gathered, curled, stained rafters, irritated eyes, and settled into clothing. The smell of smoke became part of the fabric of life, clinging to wool, hair, bedding, walls, and thatch. It could help preserve certain materials and deter some pests, but it also made breathing less pleasant, especially in winter when openings were kept limited against the cold. A medieval room could be warmer near the hearth and still harsh on the throat. This is one reason the hearth was not merely a cozy symbol. It was a compromise. To have heat, one often accepted smoke. To reduce smoke, one might lose heat. To conserve fuel, one tolerated cold. To burn hotter, one consumed precious resources faster. Every choice carried another cost. The medieval household did not live in a world of perfect solutions. It lived in a world of trade-offs. The morning meal, if there was one, often belonged to this same set of compromises. For many ordinary people, breakfast in the modern sense was not always a formal or elaborate event. Eating patterns varied by region, class, labor, and religious observance. Some people began with ale, bread, leftovers, porridge, or pottage when available. The point here is not to imagine a neatly set table, but to picture nourishment as part of survival. Something warm in the stomach could change the entire feeling of a freezing day. A bowl of thick pottage near the hearth might be plain, repetitive, and humble, yet it offered more than taste. It offered heat from the inside. Pottage was especially important because it could be adapted to what a household had. Grains, peas, beans, leeks, onions, herbs, scraps of meat if available, greens in season, or whatever could be stretched. In winter, stored foods became central. The pot near the fire was both meal and strategy. It allowed ingredients to soften slowly. It made use of fuel that was already burning, could feed several mouths, could be reheated. In a cold room, the steam from a pot was a small sign that the household had crossed from night into day. But even this simple warmth depended on water, and water in winter could be difficult. A household might draw from a well, stream, spring, or stored supply depending on place. Ice complicated the task. Mud complicated the path. Carrying water in cold weather was heavy, wet, and unpleasant. Hands chilled quickly. Spilled water could make floors more miserable. If the source lay outside the home, fetching it meant stepping from a cold room into colder air, sometimes before full daylight. The beginning of the day could involve leaving shelter in order to make shelter useful. For people with animals, the morning cold extended into byres, stables, sheds, and yards. Animals were not background details in medieval life. They were labor, food, wealth, rent, status, and risk. Oxen, horses, cows, sheep, pigs, goats, chickens, and geese all connected a household to survival. In winter, keeping animals alive mattered intensely. They needed fodder, water, shelter, and attention. A hungry animal was not an inconvenience. It could threaten the household economy. A sick animal could mean lost labor, lost milk, lost meat, lost income, or lost security, so the person waking freezing did not always have the luxury of lingering near the hearth until warmth returned. There might be a cow to milk, pigs to feed, a horse to check, chickens to release or protect, straw to move, dung to clear, or water to break through. In some arrangements, animals were kept close to the living space or under the same broad roof structure, especially in colder regions or poorer holdings. This could add warmth, but also smell, noise, dampness, and disease risk. Again, medieval comfort was built from imperfect bargains. The presence of animals could make life more livable and less pleasant at the same time. The bedding, too, belonged to this world of bargains. Straw mattresses or pallets could provide insulation from the floor, but straw aged, compressed, and absorbed damp. Could be changed, but changing bedding required access to fresh material and time. Fleas, lice, and other pests were common enough that sleep carried small irritations along with cold. A wealthier household might use feather beds, wool blankets, linen sheets, fur-lined coverings, and bed curtains. A poorer one might rely on coarse blankets, cloaks, shared coverings, and straw. The difference could be the difference between discomfort and suffering. Yet even in wealthier homes, waking cold was not unknown. Large houses were often divided into warmer and colder zones. The bedchamber might be protected, but corridors, stairs, chapels, storage rooms, and halls could be bitter. A noble person might wake within bed curtains and layered textiles, then step out into air that reminded them that wealth softened winter rather than abolishing it. Servants might rise earlier, entering colder spaces first to prepare fires, garments, food, and movement for their masters. Comfort for one group often rested upon the cold labor of another. This is a quiet but important part of the story. In medieval households, warmth was not only produced by fuel. It was produced by hierarchy. Someone gathered the wood. Someone carried it. Someone woke early. Someone cleaned ashes. Someone stood in smoky air. Someone warmed clothing, prepared food, and made the room livable before another person entered it. The higher a person stood socially, the more likely they were to experience warmth as service rather than labor. The lower a person stood, the more likely they were to meet the cold before others did. Servants in elite homes might sleep in conditions far less comfortable than the chambers they helped maintain. Apprentices in towns might sleep near workshops or in shared spaces, rising early into work that combined cold hands with strict discipline. Agricultural workers might face the day with limited bedding and little control over their schedule. A monastery might discipline the body through cold rising, but its institutional resources could still provide a more organized response to winter than a struggling cottage could. Everywhere, the experience of waking cold was filtered through status. There were also gendered patterns, though they varied by household and region. Women's work frequently tied them closely to the hearth, textiles, food preparation, children, small animals, brewing, dairy, and household management. This did not mean women simply stayed warm indoors. Indoor work could be cold, smoky, wet, repetitive, and physically demanding. Washing, kneading, carrying, spinning, mending, nursing, and cooking in winter were not gentle tasks. A woman might be near the fire and still spend the morning with chilled hands, irritated eyes, and a tired back. Textiles were one of the most important defenses against cold, and making them required enormous labor. A blanket did not appear as a simple object. It represented sheep, shearing, cleaning, carding, spinning, weaving, fulling, dyeing, trading, mending, and care. Linen underclothes required flax production and processing. Wool garments needed maintenance. Clothes were patched, handed down, remade, and valued. In a world where cold entered the room, the body had to carry its own architecture in cloth. This gives medieval clothing a deeper meaning. The hood was not only a style. The cloak was not only an image in a painting. Hose, tunics, caps, mittens, wraps, and layered garments were practical responses to buildings that could not fully protect the person inside them. To dress in the morning was to build a temporary house around the skin. And because cloth was expensive in labor and material, the quality of that little house revealed the household's means. Dressing in the cold was often a sensory trial. Garments left away from the fire could feel stiff and unpleasant at first touch. Shoes might be cold, damp, or worn. A person might hesitate before putting feet into them, knowing that the leather offered protection but not softness. If clothing had not dried properly from the day before, the morning began with a choice between wearing damp fabric or delaying work. For many, there was no real choice. Work began when work had to begin. The medieval home itself had seasonal habits. Before winter, people tried to repair roofs, gather fuel, store food, preserve meat, secure animals, and prepare clothing. Autumn was not merely picturesque. It was a race of preparation. The success of a winter morning often depended on work done months earlier. A good woodpile, a sound roof, stored grain, repaired shoes, a patched cloak, dried herbs, salted meat, and fresh bedding materials could all shape the experience of waking in January or February. Winter punished households that had too little time, too little land, too little labor, or too little luck. And luck mattered. A hard winter could overwhelm normal preparation. A roof could leak. A child could fall ill. Fuel could run low. Grain prices could rise. Animals could die. Roads could become impassable. A lord's demand, a failed harvest, a local conflict, or sickness in the family could leave a household less prepared than it wished. Medieval people did not live with a large margin of comfort. Many lived close to the line where discomfort became danger. The cold also shaped architecture in ways that are easy to overlook. Smaller spaces were easier to heat. Low ceilings helped retain warmth better than lofty spaces. Bed curtains, wall hangings, shutters, internal partitions, and loft sleeping could all affect temperature. In some homes, sleeping above animals or above a working space could provide slightly more warmth. In towns, upper rooms might benefit from heat rising from below, though they could also be drafty. The placement of the bed mattered. The direction of the wind mattered. The quality of the door mattered. Even a small gap could become memorable on a winter night. Medieval people noticed these things. They understood drafts not as an abstract problem, but as a nightly enemy. Blocking a crack with cloth, straw, boards, or whatever could be spared was a practical act. Hanging textiles on walls, laying rushes, placing bedding away from openings, gathering near the hearth, and sleeping under coverings were not random customs. They were small technologies of warmth. In many cases, survival depended less on one grand invention than on hundreds of tiny adjustments repeated without ceremony. The use of rushes on floors is often described in ways that exaggerate filth, but the basic purpose was practical. Rushes, straw, or other floor coverings could provide some insulation, absorb moisture, and make an earthen or stone floor less harsh underfoot. They could be refreshed or replaced depending on means and local practice. In a cold morning, stepping onto any covering was better than stepping directly onto bare earth or stone. Still, these materials could become dirty, damp, and worn. They helped, but imperfectly. That word, imperfectly, belongs to much of medieval winter. The fire helped imperfectly. Bedding helped imperfectly. Clothing helped imperfectly. The house helped imperfectly. Community helped imperfectly. Religion helped give meaning, but did not warm the feet by itself. Labor created heat, but also exhaustion. The whole system worked well enough for people to endure, raise families, build communities, farm fields, make goods, worship, trade, and survive across generations. But it did not make comfort easy. This is why waking freezing could become a normal part of life without becoming a trivial one. Repetition can make hardship familiar, but familiarity does not remove the burden. A medieval person might not be shocked by cold the way a modern person would be, yet the body still tightened, shivered, and resisted. Hands still lost dexterity. Feet still ached. Breath still caught in the throat. A mother still worried over a cold child. An elderly person still struggled to rise. A worker still faced the day with less rest than the body wanted. For the very poor, the difference between a cold morning and a dangerous morning could be thin. Poor clothing, inadequate food, weak shelter, and little fuel turned winter into a serious threat. Charity, kinship, parish support, lordly obligation, monastic almsgiving, and neighborly exchange could all matter, though they varied widely and were never guaranteed. The medieval community was not a modern welfare system, but neither was it always a world of total isolation. People relied on networks of obligation and reputation. In winter, those networks could become life-saving. At the same time, asking for help carried social meaning. A household's ability to maintain warmth, food, and order was tied to dignity. Needing fuel, bread, shelter, or assistance could expose vulnerability. Cold was therefore not only physical, could become social. It revealed who had resources, who had kin, who had favor, who had rights, and who was near the edge. A freezing home could quietly tell the story of status before a person said a word. In towns, fuel markets made this visible in another way. Firewood, charcoal, peat, and other fuels moved through systems of supply. Prices, access, regulation, transport, and season affected who could heat a home or workshop well. Bakers, brewers, smiths, potters, and other trades depended on heat not only for comfort but for production. Competition for fuel could be serious. A household fire was part of a larger urban appetite for burning material. Behind every warm room stood woodland management, carting, cutting, selling, and sometimes conflict. Woodlands themselves were not empty places where anyone could freely take what they wished. Rights to gather fuel could be governed by custom, manorial rules, forest law, or local agreement. Poor people might have rights to collect deadwood but not to cut living timber. They might rely on hedgerows, commons, waste ground, or purchased bundles. The cold morning inside the home was connected to the legal and economic landscape outside it. The simple question, can we make a fire, could be tied to lordship, ownership, and community rights. This connection between the domestic and the political is one of the reasons daily history matters. A king's law, a landlord's rule, a village custom, a market price, and a winter dawn could all meet in the same handful of ash. The person blowing on embers was not thinking in those grand terms, perhaps. They were thinking of flame, food, and the day's work. But history often hides inside such ordinary gestures. As the fire strengthened, the room changed slowly. Shadows moved. Damp surfaces began to release a little of their chill. Pot warmed. Children stirred. Someone coughed. Someone reached for shoes. A door opened and closed, letting in a blade of colder air. Smoke shifted. The day gathered itself, not all at once, but in layers. The medieval morning was not a clean switch from night to activity. It was a gradual recovery of motion from cold. For children, winter mornings could be both ordinary and formative. They learned early where warmth came from and how easily it disappeared. They learned to stay near the fire without getting in the way, to help carry small things, to dress quickly, to endure cold hands, and to understand that comfort followed work. Childhood in the Middle Ages was not without affection or play, but it was surrounded by practical demands. A child who woke freezing did not grow up thinking warmth was automatic. Warmth was something adults made, guarded, and sometimes failed to secure. For the elderly, the cold could narrow the world. Movement became harder. Joints stiffened. Rising from bedding took longer. A place near the hearth mattered greatly. In some households, the old might be given a warmer place out of respect, affection, or practical concern. In others, poverty limited what could be offered. Winter tested the moral structure of the household. Who received the warmest spot, who ate first, who slept closest to the fire, who had the best covering, and who bore the discomfort quietly. Sickness made cold more frightening. Medieval understandings of illness differed from modern medicine. involving humoral theory, religious interpretation, practical remedies, and local knowledge. But people knew from experience that cold, damp, hunger, and weakness belonged together in dangerous ways. A cough in winter could worry a family. A fever in a cold room could be hard to manage. Keeping someone warm required bedding, fire, attention, and time. Illness pulled resources toward one body, and in a poor household, resources were already scarce. The same fire that cooked the household's food might warm cloths for the sick, heat water for washing, dry bedding, and provide the only light by which care could continue after dark. In this sense, the hearth was also a place of medicine, not because it cured everything, but because warmth was one of the few comforts reliably understood. A chilled body needed heat. A weak person needed warm food. A damp bed needed drying. These were simple truths, and simple truths mattered in a world where many remedies were limited. Yet fire also carried danger. Open flames in timber and thatch homes required caution. Sparks could escape. Children could get too close. Clothing could catch. A household desperate for warmth still had to respect the destructive side of fire. Towns, with dense buildings and workshops, were especially vulnerable to fire hazards. Regulations about hearths, ovens, candles, and night fires appear in various urban contexts because people understood the risk. The very thing that protected a family from freezing could threaten to destroy the home. So a medieval person waking cold entered a day governed by careful attention. Watch the fire, but do not waste fuel. Warm the room, but manage smoke. Dry the clothing, but do not scorch it. Feed the animals, but conserve fodder. Open the door, but close it quickly. Work hard enough to keep the household alive, but do not exhaust the body beyond repair. None of this was dramatic in the usual historical sense. Yet it was the daily discipline on which life depended. By mid-morning, in many homes, the first sharp misery of waking might ease. Movement, food, fire, daylight, and shared labor began to take effect. But the cold did not disappear. It retreated into corners, into walls, into stored clothing, into the shaded side of the house, into the path outside, into the water bucket, into the bones of anyone who had not eaten enough. The household did not defeat winter. It negotiated with it for a few hours. And this negotiation shaped not only bodies but minds. People planned around cold. They measured tasks by available daylight. They valued sun exposure. They knew which winds were cruel. They watched the sky. They stored, mended, rationed, and prayed. They understood winter as a season that revealed truth. The truth of preparation, of wealth, of neighborliness, of health, of faith, of family strength, and of the fragile boundary between ordinary hardship and crisis. From here, the story begins to widen beyond the room itself. Because once the fire was alive, the bedding shaken, the clothes pulled on, and the first chores begun, the person who had woken freezing still had to step into the medieval day. And outside the doorway, the cold took on new forms. In the frozen track to the well, in the field that could not yet be worked, in the market road, in the stable, in the church before dawn, and in the long winter labor that made the warmth of evening possible outside the doorway, the cold was no longer just an atmosphere around the bed or a draft along the floor. It became terrain. It had texture underfoot, weight in the water bucket, resistance in the latch, stiffness in the rope, and a quiet authority over what could be done first. The person stepping out from a medieval home in winter did not enter a neatly separated outdoor world. They entered the other half of the same struggle. The hearth had made the room survivable for a while, but the morning beyond the threshold reminded everyone that warmth was temporary, local, and always being taken away. The first breath outside could feel harsher than the cold inside, partly because the body had just begun to recover a little warmth. A cloak pulled tighter around the shoulders. A hood was adjusted. Hands disappeared into sleeves when they could. The eyes watered in wind. The path near the door might be frozen hard, slick with ice, or churned into mud that had stiffened overnight. In many places, winter was not a clean white season. It was a season of wet hems, cold leather, rutted tracks, dirty snow, half-frozen puddles, and fields that seemed to hold the memory of every footstep. For a household dependent on water, the well or stream could be one of the first destinations of the day. This simple act, fetching water, reveals more about medieval cold than it first appears to. Water was necessary for cooking, brewing, washing, animals, and basic household tasks. But in winter it could become slow and unpleasant. A bucket rope might be stiff. A wooden pail might be cold enough to hurt bare fingers. Ice could form at the edge of a trough or source. A stream that ran freely in autumn might be dangerous under frost. The person carrying water back to the house brought not only a useful substance, but another piece of the cold world into the home. And once brought inside, water did not instantly become comfortable. It had to be warmed if warmth was needed, and warming water cost fuel. This meant that even washing could become a calculated act. Modern life treats warm water as ordinary, almost invisible. In a medieval household, warm water represented time, fire, and labor. A person might wash hands or face in cold water because it was available, not because it was pleasant. Full bathing, where it occurred, required far more arrangement. Winter made cleanliness harder, not necessarily because people ignored cleanliness, but because every act of washing had a material cost. This is another place where modern assumptions can mislead. Medieval people did not live in a world without ideas of cleanliness. They washed hands, faces, linens when possible, tableware, tools, and bodies according to custom, opportunity, class, and circumstance. Towns had bathhouses in some places. Monasteries had rules around washing. Elite households possessed basins, ewers, towels, and servants. But the cold season changed the calculation. It reduced comfort, slowed drying, and made warm water expensive. The issue was not simply whether people cared. It was whether the environment allowed care to become easy. For many rural households, animals demanded attention before human comfort could be fully restored. A cow waiting to be milked did not care that the floor had been freezing. A horse or ox could not be neglected because the morning was unpleasant. Chickens, pigs, sheep, goats, and geese brought their own needs into the first hour of the day. They also brought sounds, smells, and urgency. A person might move from the smoky warmth of a hearth to the damp breath of a stable or byre, where the cold mingled with the heavy warmth of animals, straw, dung, and stored fodder. Here again, winter created contradictions. Animal spaces could be warmer than open air, because living bodies generate heat. But they were also damp, dirty, and demanding. Straw had to be managed. Manure had to be cleared or shifted. Fodder had to be measured carefully. Water had to be provided. In a hard winter, stored hay and feed became precious. Too much generosity early in the season could mean shortage later. Too little could weaken the animals on which the household depended. A medieval farmer waking cold was not only thinking of personal discomfort. He or she was thinking, perhaps silently, of the remaining fodder, the condition of the beasts, and whether spring felt near enough. Livestock connected the cold morning to the year's larger economy. An ox was power for the plow. A cow was milk, manure, and potential calves. Sheep were wool, meat, milk in some regions, and value. Pigs could turn scraps and woodland mast into food. Chickens gave eggs when conditions allowed. Losing animals to cold, hunger, or disease could alter a household's future. So winter care was not background labor. It was a form of investment, a daily defense against decline. The same was true of tools. Cold could make wood, leather, and metal feel stubborn in the hand. A handle left in an unheated shed might be painfully cold. Iron tools could chill the fingers quickly. Leather harnesses could stiffen. Ropes could become awkward. Wheels, carts, gates, hinges, and latches could resist movement. The medieval day began with objects that had also spent the night freezing. The world itself seemed reluctant to function until touched, warmed, repaired, or forced back into use. This gave winter labor a particular slowness. Even when the tasks were familiar, the body and the tools both needed time. Fingers lacked their usual precision. Breath shortened in the air. Clothing protected but also restricted movement. A cloak helped against wind, yet it could catch, drag, or become heavy when wet. Gloves or mittens, when available, warmed the hands but reduced dexterity. A worker was always balancing warmth against usefulness. To do delicate work, one might need bare or lightly covered fingers, and that meant accepting pain. For field workers, the winter landscape changed the meaning of labor. The deepest cold months were not always filled with the same agricultural intensity as harvest or plowing seasons, but rural work did not vanish. Ditches needed clearing. Hedges needed mending. Wood needed cutting or gathering. Animals required care. Threshing, carting, spreading manure, repairing equipment, and preparing for the next season all continued. In some regions, winter was also a time for woodland work, fuel collection, and maintenance. The cold did not stop the agricultural year. It rearranged it. The field itself could feel like a place waiting under restraint. Frozen ground might prevent certain tasks. Mud might make others miserable. Snow could hide boundaries, paths, and hazards. A winter field was not empty simply because grain was not waving there. It held future work. It held anxiety. It held the memory of last year's harvest and the fear of the next one. A person standing at its edge in the cold morning might see not only land, but rent, dues, food, obligation, and risk. Medieval peasants were often bound into complex systems of work and payment. Some owed labor services, some paid rents, some held land under customary arrangements, and conditions varied widely across regions and centuries. But for many ordinary people, the household's warmth was inseparable from these obligations. Time spent gathering fuel, repairing a roof, or caring for animals had to fit around duties owed to lord, church, family, and community. Cold did not cancel obligation. Sometimes it made obligation feel heavier. The church, too, stood within the winter morning. Bells could mark hours, call to prayer, and remind people that time did not belong only to the household. In villages and towns, the sound of bells carried differently in cold air. A person might hear them while carrying water, feeding animals, or walking a frozen path. The church building itself was often cold, especially in stone. Worship in winter required endurance. Hands tucked into sleeves, feet on cold floors, breath in the air, bodies gathered beneath high roofs where warmth rose and vanished. Spiritual life did not float above physical discomfort. It took place inside it. For monks, canons, nuns, and other religious communities, rising in darkness for prayer could make cold a repeated discipline. Night offices and early services meant leaving bedding when the body wanted warmth most. The architecture of devotion could be beautiful and severe at the same time. A chapel might glow with candles and chant, but its stones could hold the cold like memory. The act of prayer before dawn was therefore not only verbal or spiritual. It was bodily. It required standing, kneeling, breathing, and remaining present in an environment that resisted comfort. For ordinary lay people, church attendance varied by day, duty, feast, and local practice, but the church calendar shaped the winter imagination. Christmas did not arrive as a bright commercial season of heated rooms and electric light. It came into darkness, short days, stored food, cold roads, and the hope of warmth shared in ritual. Candlemas, Lent, Saints' Days, fasts, and local observances gave structure to the cold months. Religion helped people interpret hardship, but it did not remove the practical need for firewood. In towns, the winter day had its own rhythm. Shop shutters opened reluctantly. Apprentices swept thresholds, carried goods, prepared tools, and helped revive workshop fires. Bakers and brewers were already engaged with heat in a more intense way, because their trades depended on controlled fire. Smiths worked near furnaces and forges, but that did not mean their mornings were easy. Heat in one part of a workshop could coexist with freezing corners, icy streets, and cold lodgings. A person might work near flames and still sleep in a room where the night had been bitter. Urban cold also revealed inequality in dense form. A wealthy merchant might live above or behind a shop with better furnishings, stored fuel, servants, and thick clothing. A poorer laborer, widow, apprentice, or migrant might sleep in crowded rented space, a loft, a corner, or a shared lodging where warmth was unreliable. The same street could contain very different winters. Smoke rising from chimneys or roofs did not mean everyone below them was equally warm. Markets in winter were acts of endurance. Sellers exposed hands to cold while arranging goods. Buyers inspected bread, fish, meat, cloth, fuel, pottery, leather, or vegetables with fingers that might already ache. Food could freeze or spoil differently depending on conditions. Roads affected supply. If carts were delayed, prices shifted. If fuel was scarce, households felt it quickly. A cold morning in a town was therefore not only personal discomfort. It was a market condition, a pressure on trade, a test of supply chains long before anyone used such words. Those who traveled faced an even sharper version of winter. Roads in the Middle Ages varied enormously in quality, and bad weather could turn movement into ordeal. A frozen road might be easier than mud for a time, but ice brought danger. Snow obscured holes and ruts. Rain turned paths into slow misery. Bridges, ferries, fords, and river crossings became more uncertain. Travelers needed shelter, food, animals, clothing, and luck. To wake freezing at an inn, a monastery guest house, a roadside lodging, or a borrowed floor was to face the question of whether the next stage of the journey could safely begin. Hospitality mattered in this world. A warm place by a fire could be charity, business, obligation, or mercy. Monasteries, inns, great households, and village networks all played roles in sheltering travelers, though the quality of that shelter varied. A poor traveler might accept crowded, smoky warmth as a blessing. A merchant worried about goods might value shelter for pack animals as much as for himself. A pilgrim might interpret the cold road through devotion, yet still feel every frozen mile. The body's need for warmth created forms of sociability. People gathered where fire existed. Hearths, workshops, kitchens, halls, taverns, bakehouses, bathhouses were available, and crowded living spaces. Conversation often belonged to warmth. News, gossip, bargaining, instruction, scolding, storytelling, and prayer could all happen near heat. A fire drew people not only because it warmed them, but because winter made separation costly. The cold encouraged clustering, but clustering could also sharpen tensions. Crowded rooms meant less privacy, more noise, more competition for the best place by the fire, more exposure to other people's illnesses, and more conflict over fuel or food. A family trapped indoors by weather might feel the strain of close quarters. Servants and masters, apprentices and craftsmen, parents and children, Lodgers and hosts all negotiated space in winter. The cold pressed bodies together, and where bodies gathered, social order had to be maintained. In a noble household, the mourning developed through layers of service. Fires might be lit in key rooms, clothing might be prepared, food might be organized, horses might be tended. The kitchen, often one of the most active places in a great house, began its day with heat, steam, smoke, knives, pots, and voices. Yet the warmth of the kitchen belonged to labor. Cooks, scullions, servants, and assistants endured long exposure to fire, cold drafts, wet floors, and heavy work. The noble family's comfort emerged from a hidden choreography of people rising before them. This should change how we imagine medieval luxury. Wealth did not simply mean having beautiful objects. It meant having other people manage discomfort. A warm chamber was fuel plus architecture plus textiles plus labor. A hot meal was stores plus kitchen work plus fire management. A prepared horse was stable labor before daylight. A clean linen cloth was textile labor, washing, drying, storage, and care. The rich experienced winter through buffers. The poor experienced winter more directly. Still, even among elites, travel, hunting, warfare, administration, and religious duty could expose bodies to severe cold. Medieval rulers and nobles were mobile. Courts moved. Armies moved. Messengers moved. Bishops, abbots, merchants, and officials traveled. A winter journey could humble even a high-status person. Fine clothing helped, but wet roads, cold lodgings, exhausted animals, and uncertain weather could bring discomfort into even privileged lives. The difference was that the privileged usually had more resources with which to respond. War added another dimension, though not every winter morning was shaped by conflict. Soldiers, guards, and men-at-arms knew cold in camps, watch posts, walls, and roads. Armor and weapons carried the temperature of the air. Metal could feel punishing. Wet clothing under armor or poor shelter in camp could weaken morale. Sieges in cold weather were tests of supply and endurance. But even here, the cold did not behave dramatically at every moment. It worked slowly, stiffening fingers, spoiling sleep, making food harder to prepare, turning mud to frozen ridges, and making men long for fires they could not always safely light. The cold also shaped sound. In a winter village, morning might begin with muffled animal noises, chopping wood, creaking doors, a bucket at the well, a cartwheel on hard ground, church bells, coughing, and the crackle of kindling catching. In a town, there were shutters, footsteps, bells, wheels, apprentices, animals, vendors, and the first calls of trade. In a monastery, there were bells, footsteps in cloisters, chant, and the small sounds of bodies moving through stone spaces. The Middle Ages did not wake silently. It woke in textures of labor. Smell was part of it too. Cold air could sharpen the scent of smoke, damp wool, animals, straw, stale rushes, leather, earth, and cooking grain. In an urban street, add refuse, workshops, tanneries in certain districts, market goods, horse dung, and river damp. In a great house, add kitchen smoke, spices if the household could afford them, wax or tallow, stored fabrics, and the smell of many people living close together. A freezing morning was not an empty visual scene. It was a dense sensory environment, and for the people inside it, these smells were part of ordinary navigation. Food preparation after waking could range from minimal to elaborate depending on status. A poor household might stretch leftovers, warm pottage, eat bread with ale, or wait until later. Workers might carry food with them, especially if the day required leaving the home. In wealthier households, kitchens might produce more varied fare, though religious calendars shaped what could be eaten. Fasting days, abstinence from meat, feast days, and local customs affected winter meals. The body wanted warmth and calories. Religion and economy shaped how those needs could be met. The relationship between ale and cold deserves careful explanation. In many medieval communities, ale or beer was a common daily drink, partly because brewing made use of grain and produced a safer, nourishing beverage in contexts where water quality varied. It was not simply drunkenness. Ale could be weak, ordinary, and part of household nutrition. In winter, consuming ale, bread, and warm food belonged to the practical rhythm of the day. Brewing itself required fuel, vessels, grain, water, skill, and time. Once again, warmth, food, and labor were intertwined. The work of women in brewing and baking was especially important in many communities. Alewives and household brewers contributed to local economies. Baking could happen at home or in communal or lord-controlled ovens, depending on local arrangements. In cold weather, the oven was a place of heat, but access to it could involve rules, payment, timing, and labor. Bread was not merely a food item. It was part of a system of grain, milling, fuel, obligation, and community control. The freezing morning therefore opens into the wider medieval economy. A piece of bread near a hearth connects to fields, mills, rents, weather, fuel, ovens, and labor. A blanket connects to sheep, wool, spinning, weaving, and trade. A shoe connects to livestock, tanning, leatherwork, markets, and repair. A fire connects to woods, rights, carts, tools, and household management. Cold makes these connections visible because every comfort has to be produced. This is why a careful history of medieval winter cannot be only about suffering. It is also about systems. People survived because they knew how to connect household routines with seasonal preparation, community practices, and available resources. A village might share certain tasks, maintain paths, help in emergencies, lend tools, exchange labor, or offer shelter. Towns created rules around markets, fuel, fire safety, and trade. Monasteries stored food, managed estates, and offered forms of charity. Lords extracted dues, but also had customary roles in protection and order, though the reality varied widely. Winter exposed both dependence and hierarchy. Children learned these systems by participation. They watched who rose first, who controlled the fire, who received the warmest place, who went outside, who stayed near the hearth, who carried water, who fed animals, who mended clothing, and who made decisions about fuel. They learned the meaning of class not through theory, but through where their bodies were placed in relation to warmth. A child in a wealthy household might associate morning cold with servants preparing comfort. A child in a poor household might associate it with helping before fully awake. The cold also shaped emotional memory. Repeated experiences of winter could become part of how people understood home. Home was not necessarily a place of constant comfort. It was the place where one's people, tools, animals, bedding, food stores, and fire existed together. It was the place where cold was fought most intimately. To be homeless, displaced, widowed, orphaned, exiled, or traveling in winter was especially dangerous because it meant losing access to that fragile cluster of protections. Charity in winter had a physical urgency. Giving fuel, food, shelter, clothing, or a place by the fire could mean more than kindness. Could mean preserving life. Religious teachings about charity were not abstract in the cold months. The sight of someone poorly clothed, hungry, or exposed carried immediate meaning. Medieval communities could be harsh, suspicious, and unequal, but they also understood vulnerability in material terms. Cold made need visible, and yet cold could also be used as discipline. In households, monasteries, schools, and workplaces, endurance was expected. Apprentices might be roused early. Servants could be given little comfort. Religious communities might treat bodily hardship as spiritually useful. Parents train children into the demands of their world. The line between necessary toughness and imposed suffering was not always clear. Medieval culture did not always aim to remove discomfort. Sometimes it taught people to live through it, interpret it, or accept it as part of order. This is one of the deeper differences between medieval and modern comfort. Modern societies, at least in wealthier settings, often treat cold indoors as a problem to be solved completely. Medieval people treated it as a condition to be managed. They improved it where they could, complained when it became severe, feared it when it threatened survival, and built routines around it. But they did not expect the entire environment to be brought under human control. Their homes were shelters, not climate-controlled worlds. As daylight strengthened, the medieval day widened. More doors opened. Smoke rose from more roofs. Paths filled gradually with movement. A person who had woken freezing might now be in a field, a yard, a workshop, a kitchen, a stable, a market, a chapel, or on the road. The first shock of waking had passed, but the body carried its memory. Cold hands remembered the bucket. Damp feet remembered the path. Smoke remembered the hearth in the eyes and throat. The day's labor did not erase the morning. It built upon it. By late morning, some people might find warmth through work. A smith near a forge, a baker near an oven, a cook near a kitchen fire, a spinner in a crowded room, a servant moving constantly through a household, a farmer clearing dung or hauling wood. All could become warm from exertion. But this warmth was not rest. It was heat purchased with effort. The body might stop shivering only because it had begun spending itself. For others, the cold remained stubborn. A guard standing still, a market seller exposed to wind, a traveler on horseback, a shepherd watching animals, a fisher near water, a poor elderly person near a weak fire, or a child sent on an errand might not generate enough warmth. Medieval winter created different experiences depending on motion. Those who could move too little suffered. Those who had to move too much exhausted themselves. The best warmth was controlled warmth, and controlled warmth belonged most easily to those with resources. The sun, when it appeared, mattered greatly. A sunny winter day could change the mood of a village or town. People might choose tasks according to light and exposure. Walls facing the sun, sheltered courtyards, south-facing slopes, and dry paths all became valuable. Medieval people observed microclimates closely because small differences mattered. A patch of sun was not a decorative detail. It was relief, but daylight was brief. The knowledge of evening was present even in the morning. The household had to think ahead. Would there be enough fuel for tonight? Would clothes dry before dark? Would animals be secure? Would water be stored? Would the fire survive? Would anyone need to travel before the temperature fell again? Winter compressed time. The day's work was not only about completing tasks. It was about preparing for the next cold return. This circular rhythm gave medieval winter its particular heaviness. People woke cold, worked to create warmth, used warmth to complete tasks, spent the day defending against cold, and then prepared to sleep in a world where the same struggle would begin again before dawn. The repetition could be numbing, but it could also create expertise. The best-run households were not necessarily the richest, though wealth helped. They were households that understood timing. When to rise, when to feed the fire, when to cook, when to dry cloth, when to fetch water, when to shut doors, when to conserve, and when to spend precious fuel. Toward the middle of the day, if conditions allowed, warmth might gather briefly in the most active spaces. The hearth burned stronger. Pot thickened. Animals settled after feeding. Tools became easier in the hand. Children became louder. A workshop found its rhythm. A market became busier. The medieval world, which had seemed stiff and reluctant in the first cold hour, became more fully alive. But this liveliness was never separate from the season. It existed because many people had already done the hidden work of dragging the day out of freezing darkness. And as the afternoon approached, the question quietly changed. The problem was no longer only how to survive the morning cold. It was how to carry enough warmth, food, fuel, and strength through the remaining daylight so that evening did not arrive as a defeat. Because in medieval winter, the day did not simply end when work stopped. It turned back toward the home, toward the hearth, toward damp clothing, tired animals, short light, and the careful preparations that would decide whether the next morning began with living embers or dead ash. Whether the next morning began with living embers or dead ash depended on decisions made while the present day was still fading. In a medieval winter, evening did not arrive as a clean release from labor. It arrived as a narrowing of possibilities. Light withdrew from fields, yards, roads, and workshops, and the household had to gather itself inward before darkness made every task harder. The fire that had been coaxed awake in the morning now had to be judged again. Should it be built up for cooking? Should fuel be saved? Could damp clothing be dried before sleep? Could embers be banked well enough to survive the night? A family that woke freezing in the Middle Ages was often a family that had spent the evening before trying, with limited means, to make the next dawn less severe. The return home at the end of a cold day could feel like relief, but rarely like modern comfort. A worker coming in from the fields, a servant returning from errands, a child sent to fetch something, or a traveler reaching shelter all carried the outside world back with them. Mud clung to shoes. Wet hems brushed against legs. Hands were stiff. Breath was short. Clothing might be damp from rain, sweat, snow, or fog. The doorway became a place of transition, but also of invasion. Each opening let in a rush of cold air, and each body entering brought more moisture, more smells, more noise, and more need. Inside, the hearth became crowded with purposes. It was not only a place to warm hands. It was the cooking place, drying place, gathering place, light source, and often the emotional center of the room. Someone might be stirring a pot while another tried to dry stockings or shoes nearby. A child might edge close for heat and be told to move away from sparks. Tools might be placed where they could dry or be repaired. A damp cloak might hang where smoke and heat could reach it, though not always enough to dry it fully. In such a room, comfort was never simple. The same fire had to serve too many needs. Evening food mattered deeply because it helped the body face the long cold hours ahead. In many households, the main meal could vary according to region, class, work pattern, and season, but winter encouraged warm, filling food when it was available. Pottage, bread, ale, cheese, beans, peas, onions, roots, preserved meat, fish on certain days, and whatever remained from stores might form the basis of the evening. To a modern ear, such food may sound plain. But in a cold room, a warm bowl could be a private mercy. It heated the hands through the vessel, the face through the steam, and the body from within. The pot itself was an object of continuity. It might hold the remains of earlier cooking, be stretched with new ingredients, or sit near the fire through much of the day. In poorer homes, waste was dangerous. Scraps could become flavor. Bones could become broth. Stale bread could be softened. A leek, a handful of peas, a little fat, or herbs from storage could change the feel of a meal. Winter cooking was less about abundance than management. It asked how little could be made to satisfy enough, and how warmth could be shared without exhausting the fuel that created it. Fuel in the evening was always watched. A large, lively fire looked comforting, but it consumed the future. A smaller fire preserved wood or turf but gave less heat. The household had to think not only of the present hour, but of the night, the morning, and the remaining weeks of winter. If the fuel pile was strong, the mood could be easier. If it was shrinking too quickly, every log carried anxiety. In a hard season, the sight of fuel disappearing could be as troubling as the sight of grain stores sinking lower in a chest or bin. This is where medieval cold becomes a kind of arithmetic. How many nights remain before spring softens the air? How much would remain stacked? How much can be gathered if weather allows? Who has rights to collect more? Can anything be bought? Can poorer fuel be mixed with better fuel? Can fires be kept low except when cooking? Can people sleep closer together? Can one room be warmed instead of several? These were not calculations written neatly on paper in most households. They were felt through habit, worry, and household conversation. In wealthier houses, the same arithmetic existed, but with more favorable numbers. Great households consumed enormous amounts of fuel, especially in kitchens, halls, chambers, bakehouses, brewhouses, and workshops. They might command wood from estates, purchase supplies, or organize labor to bring it in. Yet their comfort required planning on a large scale. A noble hall glowing in winter depended on carts, woodsmen, servants, storage, and management. The beauty of a bright fire concealed a system of extraction and labor that stretched far beyond the room. In poorer homes, the fire could not always dominate the space. Sometimes the household clustered close to it, accepting smoke and crowding because distance meant cold. The best place near the hearth carried value. Who sat there could reveal age, authority, illness, affection, or hierarchy. A grandmother might be placed closer because her body struggled with cold. A young child might be pulled near for warmth but kept back from danger. The person cooking had to occupy the working heat, which could be both privilege and burden. A tired laborer might want the warmest place but not always receive it. The fire organized the room socially. There was a kind of unspoken choreography around evening warmth. People entered, removed or adjusted outer layers, shook off damp, placed items to dry, checked animals, prepared food, repaired small things, and made space for sleep. The room had to transform from daytime workspace into nighttime shelter. In a single-room dwelling, this transformation was especially intimate. The same area where food had been cooked, children had played, tools had been handled, and smoke had drifted all day now became the sleeping place. Privacy was minimal. Warmth mattered more. Preparing bedding was not a small act. Straw might be shifted or shaken. Blankets and cloaks might be arranged. If bedding had absorbed damp, the household might try to warm or dry it near the fire, but there was rarely enough space or heat to make everything pleasant. A bed near the wall might be colder because walls held the chill. A bed too close to the fire carried risk from sparks, smoke, and disturbance. If there were bed curtains, they had to be drawn carefully. If several people shared coverings, bodies had to settle in a way that preserved warmth. Sleep was arranged, not simply entered. For those with animals nearby, the evening required another round of care. Beasts had to be secured, fed, and sheltered as well as the household could manage. A neglected animal could suffer overnight. A poorly closed gate or door could invite loss. Predators, thieves, weather, and accident were all concerns depending on place. In bitter cold, animals might be brought closer, or their bedding refreshed, or their shelter checked. Their warmth and survival mattered to the humans inside. The household and its animals formed one fragile economy of bodies against winter. The sounds of evening differed from morning. Morning had the sound of awakening and resistance. Evening had the sound of return and containment. Doors closed more firmly. Latches were checked. Pots scraped. Firewood cracked. Children grew restless or sleepy. Someone coughed in the smoke. Animals shifted in nearby spaces. Wind found the weak points of the building and made them known. In a house with shutters, they might be closed against darkness and cold, but closing out the night also closed in the smoke, smell, and crowding of the room. Light was another form of wealth. The fire gave some illumination, but firelight was uneven. Candles and lamps helped, but they cost resources. Tallow candles smelled and smoked. Wax candles were more expensive and often associated with churches or wealthier settings. Rushlights, oil lamps, and other forms of lighting varied by region and means. For many ordinary people, winter evenings were darker than modern imagination easily accepts. Darkness changed what could be done. Fine work became difficult. Movement slowed. The household gathered around the light it could afford. This darkness shaped sleep. In winter, the long night might suggest long rest, but medieval sleep was not necessarily continuous or easy. Some scholars have discussed patterns of segmented sleep in pre-modern Europe, with people sometimes waking during the night for prayer, quiet work, reflection, tending fires, or other activities. But whether one slept in one stretch or several, the cold could interrupt the body's rest. A person might wake because the fire had fallen low, because a covering slipped, because a child cried, because animals stirred, because wind shifted, or because the body simply felt the cold too sharply to remain asleep. The fear of the fire going out was not always dramatic, but it was practical. Before sleep, embers might be banked under ash to preserve them safely until morning. This required judgment. Too much exposure and the fuel burned away. Too little care and the embers died. Too much danger and the household risked fire. A carefully banked hearth was a promise made to the next dawn. It said that morning might begin with revival rather than struggle. It was one of the quiet skills that separated a slightly easier life from a harder one. In wealthier homes, warming the bed itself could be part of evening preparation. Bed warmers, heated stones, warmed cloths, or servants managing chamber fires helped ease the shock of entering bedding. But these comforts were uneven and often dependent on status. A noble or prosperous merchant might expect a sleeping space prepared in advance. A servant might prepare it while returning later to a much colder bed of their own. The warmth of the privileged was often timed, arranged, and delivered by others. For the poor, the body was often the bed warmer. People might go to sleep wearing more clothing than modern sleepers would find comfortable. They might keep caps on, wrap feet, share blankets, and lie close. If garments were damp, sleeping in them could be miserable, but removing them might be worse. Choices were shaped by necessity. A person might prefer discomfort that preserved warmth over cleanliness or softness that surrendered it. There was also the issue of breath. In a cold room, breathing itself could feel different. Damp air, smoke, and chill could irritate the throat and chest. A person already coughing might find night especially difficult. Children and older people were vulnerable. Without modern heating or medicine, the household's remedies were practical, local, and limited. Warmth, rest when possible, herbs, broths, prayer, charms in some contexts, advice from neighbors, or care from someone with experience. The cold room became both bedroom and sick room when illness entered. For women caring for infants, winter nights could be especially demanding. A crying child in a cold room was not only a disturbance. It was urgency. The child had to be warmed, fed, soothed, changed if possible, and kept safe. A mother or caregiver might lose much of the night's rest. The warmth of shared sleeping could protect, but it also required caution and constant awareness. In poor households, infant care unfolded inside the same smoky, crowded, cold conditions that shaped everyone else's life. The vulnerability of small children made the cold more emotionally charged. Elderly people faced their own nighttime struggle. Rising in the dark to relieve oneself, tend the fire, or respond to a household need could be painful and risky. Floors were uneven. Light was weak. cold stiffened limbs. A fall could be serious. The best place to sleep, the easiest access to warmth, and the availability of help mattered greatly. In winter, age altered geography inside the home. A few feet closer to the hearth could mean less pain. A better covering could mean safer sleep. The medieval night also belonged to fear, though not always in the supernatural way modern storytelling prefers. Of course, medieval people lived in a world rich with beliefs about spirits, saints, demons, omens, and unseen forces. Darkness had spiritual and imaginative power, but the more ordinary fears were just as strong. A roof leak, a dying fire, a sick child, a hungry animal, a stranger outside, thieves, fire, storm damage, or the realization that food and fuel might not last. The winter night gave worries more space. The house itself made noises as it cooled. Timber shifted, thatch rustled, wind pressed against shutters. Animals moved, ash settled. In a crowded room, someone turned over, someone whispered, someone breathed heavily. If rain fell, drops might find weak points in the roof. If snow accumulated, weight became a concern. If the wind came from a certain direction, a known draft might cut across the room. Medieval people knew their houses by these sounds. A home was not a silent container. It was a structure in conversation with weather. One of the subtler truths is that medieval people could feel deep attachment to homes that were uncomfortable. A cold, smoky, crowded dwelling could still be the center of memory, kinship, and identity. It held tools, bedding, saints' images perhaps, stored food, family objects, inherited practices, and the fire around which life gathered. Comfort, in the modern sense, was only one part of belonging. A person might long for warmth and still love the room where their family survived. This helps us avoid a shallow interpretation. The cold did not make medieval life merely bleak. It made it communal, disciplined, resourceful, anxious, and intimate. It shaped where people sat when they spoke, how they slept, what they valued, and how they measured competence. A household that managed winter well earned a kind of quiet respect. It had enough fuel, mended clothing, stored food, living animals, dry bedding, and a hearth that could be trusted. These were not glamorous achievements, but they were fundamental ones. In villages, evening cold could also draw people toward shared places when circumstances allowed. A neighbor's hearth, a lord's hall on certain occasions, a tavern or alehouse, a bakehouse, or a communal gathering might offer warmth, conversation, and information. Yet leaving home at night in winter required reason. The road was dark, cold, and sometimes unsafe. The choice to go out after dusk was not casual. It depended on distance, weather, obligation, and social purpose. Alehouses and taverns held particular importance in some communities, not only as places of drinking, but as spaces of warmth, exchange, and news. In cold months, the attraction of a heated, populated room was obvious. But money, reputation, and local morality shaped who went, how long they stayed, and what was said about it. Warmth could be social, but social warmth carried risks of gossip, debt, conflict, or disorder. The hearth outside one's own home was never neutral. In towns, evening brought curfews and fire regulations in various forms. The very word curfew is connected to covering fires, and many medieval towns took the danger of night fires seriously. Dense wooden buildings, thatch, workshops, ovens, and candles created constant risk. Authorities might require fires to be controlled, covered, or extinguished at certain times, depending on place and period. This meant that the desire for warmth had to be balanced against the fear of urban disaster. A city could not allow every household or workshop to treat fire carelessly. For a town resident, therefore, night warmth could be regulated as well as limited. The household might want a stronger fire, but safety rules, fuel cost, and neighborly danger all mattered. Fire was private comfort and public threat at the same time. A careless spark in one building could become everyone's catastrophe. Medieval urban life required people to think of heat collectively, even when they felt cold individually. In castles and great houses, evening had another character. The great hall might host meals, conversation, administration, entertainment, and ceremony. Fires burned. Torches or candles gave light. Dogs might lie near warmth. Servants moved constantly. Guests observed rank through seating, food, and proximity. Yet beyond the central spaces lay cold passages, service rooms, storage areas, outer wards, stables, kitchens, and quarters where comfort thinned. The hall's warmth did not belong equally to everyone who made the household function. A servant carrying dishes from a hot kitchen through a cold passage might experience the building as alternating climates. A guard on watch might stand in bitter air while those inside ate. A kitchen worker might be overheated near fire and then chilled by drafts. A laundress, stable hand, scullion, page, cook, chaplain, clerk, lady, lord, and guest all inhabited different winters within the same estate. Architecture organized inequality by temperature. The bedchamber of the wealthy was often where medieval comfort became most deliberate. Hangings on walls softened cold surfaces. Carpets or coverings reduced the harshness of floors where available. Bed curtains made a smaller enclosure. Chests held textiles. Servants could bring warmed items. The chamber might be smaller and easier to heat than the hall. Privacy, status, and warmth met in the same room. Yet this comfort could not be taken for granted. It had to be created every evening, maintained through resources, and renewed each day. For religious communities, evening and night were not simply private time. Prayer structured darkness. The cycle of offices could interrupt sleep, turning the coldest hours into moments of worship. A monk rising from bed for the night office might feel the shock that any human body feels, but interpret it through obedience and discipline. The cold chapel, the chant, the candlelight, and the stone floor formed an atmosphere in which bodily discomfort was woven into spiritual practice. It is important not to romanticize this. Discipline could be meaningful and still physically hard. The wider medieval imagination gave winter symbolic weight. Cold could represent hardship, age, death, purification, punishment, endurance, or the turning of the year toward renewal. But symbols did not replace chores. A peasant did not stop needing dry shoes because winter had poetic meaning. A monk did not stop shivering because cold had spiritual value. Medieval people could hold both realities at once. The cold as meaning and the cold as bodily fact. In households that possessed books or heard stories read aloud, winter evenings could become times of narration. In many communities, oral storytelling carried memory, entertainment, instruction, and identity. Around a fire, with darkness pressing close, stories had a natural place. Saints' lives, local tales, family memories, romances, moral examples, and news from travelers could fill the long hours. The cold helped create the setting for listening. It drew people inward. It made the fire not only a heat source, but a center of imagination. Yet for many, fatigue shortened the evening. A day spent hauling, tending, cooking, repairing, walking, or standing in cold air left the body heavy. Sleep might come early because candles were costly and labor had consumed the person's strength. The long winter night was not always filled with conversation. Sometimes it was filled with the quiet collapse of tired bodies into bedding that was not warm enough, hoping that closeness and coverings would do what fuel could not. Before lying down, the household might perform small acts that reveal its priorities. A door barred, a tool brought inside to prevent damage or theft, a cloak placed where it might dry, children settled, an animal checked one last time, pot moved to safety, embers covered, prayer spoken. These gestures were ordinary, but they were also protective. They marked the border between the active day and the vulnerable night. The prayer, when present, placed the household within a larger order. Medieval Christianity saturated much of European life, though practice varied and belief was lived differently by different people. Evening prayers, blessings, signs of the cross, invocations of saints, or simple habits of devotion offered a sense that the night was not faced alone. Cold, darkness, illness, and danger were physical realities, but they were also interpreted within a spiritual universe. To sleep was to surrender control for several hours. Prayer gave that surrender form. Still, the body remained practical. A person might pray and then reach immediately to pull a blanket tighter. Faith and physical need were not competitors. They were intertwined. A saint might be asked for protection, while the sleeper also turned toward another body for warmth. The medieval night was full of such combinations. Sacred words, smoky air, rough wool, old straw, dying embers, and the quiet hope of waking safely. As the fire fell lower, the room's temperature changed again. The first hour after lying down might be tolerable if bodies and bedding held warmth. Later, as flames faded and the structure surrendered heat to the night, cold returned. Came gradually, then insistently. The edges of the bedding chilled. Exposed skin noticed the air. A sleeper who had felt warm enough at first might wake before dawn with stiff fingers or cold feet. If the household was lucky, embers still lived under ash. If not, the morning would begin harder. The deepest cold often came before sunrise. This made the final hours of sleep especially fragile. People might curl inward, pull coverings over the head, press closer to a bedmate, or lie awake waiting for the first signs of morning duty. In that dim interval, the line between night and day blurred. The household was not yet active, but rest had already weakened. The mind could begin counting tasks before the body rose. Fire, water, animals, food, work, road, church, field, shop. For those sleeping alone, the cold could feel more severe. Widows, widowers, travelers, servants in separate spaces, shepherds, guards, or the poor without shared bedding faced a different night. Human warmth was a resource, and solitude could be costly. This is one reason shared sleeping arrangements should not be judged only through modern ideas of privacy. In winter, sleeping with others was a practical technology. It reduced the cold by making the body part of a group system, but shared sleep also meant shared disturbance. If one person turned, coughed, cried, rose, or brought in cold air, others felt it. If a child wet bedding, if someone was feverish, if pests irritated the skin, if a quarrel continued into the night, there was little separation. The same closeness that preserved warmth reduced peace. Medieval households often traded solitude for survival, and the result was a kind of rest that could be protective without being truly restful. As dawn approached, the first person awake became the bridge between night and day. Sometimes that person woke by habit, sometimes because duty required it, sometimes because cold would not allow more sleep. They listened for weather, animals, movement, and the state of the fire. They might remain still for a moment, reluctant to leave the small warmth of bedding. Then came the decision that had repeated through countless winter mornings, to rise into cold before comfort existed, in order to create the conditions by which others could rise. This first rising was one of the quiet, heroic acts of ordinary medieval life. Not heroic in the grand, sung by poets sense, but in the modest, repeated sense that keeps households alive. Someone had to be first to lose the bed's warmth. Someone had to touch the cold floor. Someone had to test the ash, gather tinder, step outside if necessary, and begin again. History rarely names this person. It may have been a mother, a servant, a daughter, an apprentice, an elderly relative, a hired hand, a monk, or a farmer. But without them, the day did not begin. And once again, the embers mattered. If the ash was stirred and a red glow answered, the household had been granted continuity. Yesterday's fire had survived into today. A breath, a bit of tinder, and careful feeding could bring it back. If there was only gray powder and black dead wood, then the morning opened with more work, more delay, and a sharper awareness of failure or bad luck. The difference between living ember and dead ash was small to the eye, but enormous to the body. From that small glow, the day would slowly rebuild itself. The room would fill with smoke before warmth. The first pot would be moved near the heat. Clothing would be gathered. Animals would stir. The door would open to the waiting cold. And beyond the home, the larger medieval world would begin again. Fields, roads, workshops, chapels, markets, manors, barns, and frozen paths, all depending on thousands of households performing the same fragile recovery from night. But to understand why some mornings were merely uncomfortable while others became dangerous, we have to look next at the moments when winter exceeded ordinary endurance, when fuel ran short, food thinned, illness entered the room, and the cold stopped being a familiar hardship and became a threat that could change the fate of a family. When fuel ran short, food thinned, illness entered the room, and the cold stopped being a familiar hardship, medieval winter changed its meaning. It was no longer simply the season that made floors hard, hands stiff, and mornings reluctant. It became a test of the household's entire structure. Every earlier preparation, every stored bundle of wood, every repaired shoe, every sack of grain, every relationship with neighbors, every custom of sharing or withholding, every right to gather fuel, and every fragile body under the roof now mattered more than it had in milder weather. Winter revealed the strength of a home, but it also revealed its weaknesses without mercy. The frightening part was that danger did not always arrive dramatically. A family might not wake one morning to catastrophe. Instead, the decline could be gradual. The fire burned smaller. Meals became thinner. Damp clothing dried less completely. Cough lasted longer. The old person near the hearth became quieter. Children slept badly. Animals grew leaner. A roof leak that had once seemed manageable became a serious problem because the bedding could not dry. A path to the well became difficult enough to delay water. A household that had endured cold for weeks could suddenly find that ordinary endurance was no longer enough. This is one of the most important differences between discomfort and crisis. Medieval people expected discomfort. They had practices for it, language for it, and forms of patience that modern comfort can make difficult to imagine. But crisis began when the familiar systems failed. Fire could not be kept. Food could not be stretched. Someone could not rise. A child could not be warmed. An animal could not be fed. A debt could not be paid. A road could not be traveled. The cold became dangerous not only because it was cold, but because it attacked everything that helped a household answer it.I in a poor home. A shrinking fuel supply could dominate the atmosphere of the room. A log was not merely a log. It was part of tomorrow morning. A bundle of brushwood represented one meal, 1 hour of warmth, one chance to dry a child's clothing, one evening where the old could sit a little easier. To burn more now might mean suffering later. To burn less now might mean sickness, sleeplessness, or misery immediately. The family did not choose between comfort and luxury. They chose between forms of need. Food worked the same way. A thick pottage could become thinner. Bread could be saved for laborers or shared carefully among children. Meat, if present, might be salted, stretched, or reserved. Cheese, peas, beans, onions, roots, grains, ale, and leftovers carried different meanings depending on how much remained. Hunger made cold sharper. A body without enough nourishment could not produce heat as well, could not work as effectively, and could not recover as easily from illness. In winter, hunger and cold were partners. Each made the other more difficult to survive. The household's animals also stood near this edge. If fodder ran low, the family faced choices that could shape the next season. Feeding an animal preserved future labor, milk, wool, manure, or value. But feeding animals also consumed stores that might be needed elsewhere. Selling an animal, slaughtering it, or watching it weaken could change the household's prospects for spring. The medieval winter did not remain politely inside the category of weather. It reached into economics, labor, inheritance, rent, and hope. Illness could turn an already cold room into a place of fear. A cough, fever, weakness, or chest trouble was harder to manage when warmth was scarce and bedding damp. Medieval medicine offered remedies, care, prayer, and experience, but it did not offer the security modern people often expect. A family might know that someone needed heat, broth, rest, and dry coverings, while lacking enough of each. The sick body drew the household's resources toward it, and when resources were limited, love and anxiety could be felt in the same gesture. Placing someone closer to the fire, giving them the warmer covering, saving a better portion of food, or rising in the night to check whether they still breathed easily. The elderly carried winter in a special way. Age made rising harder, circulation poorer, and recovery slower. An older person might remember many winters and still fear the next cold morning. Their knowledge could be valuable: how to bank a fire, how to read the weather, how to stretch food, how to mend, how to judge fuel, how to endure. But their bodies might be more vulnerable than their memories. In a crowded medieval room, the old were not separate from household life. They were often present within it, needing care while also holding experience that helped others survive. Children, too, made cold emotionally heavier. A child might accept a freezing morning as ordinary because it was all they knew, but ordinary did not mean harmless. Small bodies lost warmth quickly. Wet clothing, poor shoes, thin bedding, and smoky rooms all mattered. A child might be sent on errands, asked to help with animals, or expected to learn the daily discipline of winter early. The cold became part of education. Not a lesson written in a book, but a lesson in the hands, feet, breath, and household routine. They learned that warmth was made by work, protected by care, and never guaranteed. In some cases, support came from beyond the immediate family. Neighbors might lend fuel, share food, help repair damage, look after animals, or offer a warmer corner in emergency. Kinship mattered. Parish charity mattered. Monasteries and religious houses could provide alms or shelter in certain circumstances. Lords and local customs might carry obligations, though how generously those obligations were fulfilled varied greatly. Medieval society was not simply a cold world of isolated suffering. It was a world of relationships, duties, reputations, and inequalities. In hard winter, those relationships were tested. But help was not always easy to ask for or receive. Need exposed vulnerability. A household that could not keep itself warm might feel shame, fear, or dependence. Charity could preserve life, but it could also remind the recipient of their position. In small communities, everyone knew who had enough wood, whose animals looked thin, whose roof was failing, whose children were poorly clothed, who had borrowed grain, and who had not repaid. Winter made private hardship visible. This social visibility mattered because medieval life was deeply local. Reputation could influence credit, marriage prospects, work opportunities, neighborly trust, and legal standing. A freezing home was not only a domestic problem. It could signal poverty, misfortune, poor management, bad luck, illness, widowhood, old age, or social weakness. Of course, people knew that hardship could strike unfairly, but they also judged. The cold entered moral imagination as well as physical experience. And yet, despite all of this, medieval people did not simply collapse under winter. They endured with habits that had been refined over generations. They knew how to layer clothing, share beds, dry garments imperfectly, preserve embers, stretch meals, watch animals, seal drafts, repair tools, and plan around daylight. They knew which neighbors might help, which paths became dangerous, which roofs needed watching, which winds found the door, and which stored foods could last longest. Their intelligence was practical, local, and often quiet. This is why the image of waking freezing in the Middle Ages should not be reduced to misery alone. It was misery sometimes, certainly. It was discomfort often. But it was also a world of skill. A person who could carry a household through winter possessed knowledge that may not appear heroic in chronicles but was essential to life. Keeping a fire alive, managing scarce fuel, feeding a family, caring for animals, preventing damp, and rising before dawn when the bed was the only warm place left. These were forms of competence on which entire communities depended. The expectation reversal at the heart of this history is that medieval cold was not merely a lack of technology. It was a whole way of organizing life around limits. The home, the body, the field, the church, the market, the forest, and the family were all connected by the need for warmth. Firewood linked domestic comfort to land rights. Bedding linked sleep to textile labor. Hot food linked the stomach to harvest and fuel. A warm chamber linked wealth to service. A shared bed linked survival to the loss of privacy. The cold made society visible because every defense against it came from somewhere. For the rich, cold was softened through architecture, textiles, servants, mobility, and command over resources. Could still be unpleasant, but it was buffered. For the poor, cold was more direct, entering through walls, shoes, meals, and sleep. For monks and nuns, cold could become discipline. For travelers, it became risk. For servants, it became labor before others woke. For children, it became normality. For the old and sick, it could become danger. There was no single medieval winter. There were many winters divided by class, region, age, health, gender, occupation, and luck. Still, the shared experience of cold gave the medieval year a rhythm modern life often hides. Winter was not a decorative backdrop. It shortened the day, thickened the darkness, changed work, shaped worship, strained supplies, slowed travel, and drew people toward fire. It made the household smaller and the world harder to cross. It turned warmth into an achievement rather than a setting. And perhaps this is why the subject feels so strangely intimate. To understand medieval cold, we do not need to begin with a battlefield or throne. We can begin with a person opening their eyes before dawn, feeling the air under the blanket, and realizing the day has already made a demand. That moment, simple as it seems, contains much of the Middle Ages. It contains material limits: timber, stone, thatch, wool, straw, ash, and iron. It contains social order. Who wakes first? Who gets the warmest place? Who prepares the fire? Who is better bedding? Who sleeps alone? Who sleeps crowded? It contains economy: fuel, food, rents, rights, markets, animals, and labor. It contains belief: prayers in darkness, saints invoked for protection, suffering interpreted through a sacred world. It contains emotion: reluctance, patience, irritation, fear, care, and the small gratitude of seeing embers still alive. And it reminds us that history is not only what people decided in public. It is also what their bodies had to endure privately. Many medieval lives were shaped by conditions so ordinary that chroniclers rarely pause to describe them. A cold floor, a smoky hearth, a damp cloak, a thin meal, a shared blanket, a frozen path to water, a child coughing before sunrise, a servant touching ash to see whether the fire had lived. These details may seem small, but they are the texture through which the larger past was actually experienced. By spring, when it came, the change must have felt profound. Longer light, softer ground, fresh growth, easier water, and less desperate fuel needs did not erase hardship, but they altered the household's mood. Doors could open longer, clothing could dry more easily, animals could graze, work intensified in other ways, but the particular pressure of winter loosened. The body that had spent months defending itself against cold could feel the season turn not as an idea, but as relief in the hands and lungs. Yet the memory of winter did not vanish. It shaped preparation for the next one. It taught caution. It reminded families to gather, mend, store, and watch. Medieval life moved in cycles, and each cycle carried the knowledge that warmth was temporary. Summer's abundance had to be managed with winter in mind. Autumn's labor had to prepare for darkness. Winter's endurance had to hold until spring. The year was a wheel of necessity, and cold was one of its strongest spokes. So when we imagine what it was like to wake up freezing in the Middle Ages, we should not picture only a shivering figure in a dark cottage. We should picture a whole world built around that shiver. The wall that failed to keep out the draft. The fire that might or might not revive. The person who rose first. The food that had to be stretched. The animal waiting in the byre. The water outside. The church bell in the cold air. The market road. The shrinking fuel pile. The warmest place by the hearth. The small red ember under ash, carrying yesterday into today. That ember may be the best image to leave with. It was fragile, ordinary, and powerful. It could vanish if neglected, yet if preserved, it could rebuild the morning. In a world without easy heat, the survival of a tiny glow mattered. It meant less struggle, faster food, warmer hands, and a room slowly returning to life. It was not comfort in the modern sense. It was continuity. And perhaps that is the deeper lesson of medieval winter. People did not live without comfort because they did not value it. They valued it intensely. They valued it in forms that were smaller, harder won, and more communal than many of us are used to noticing. A dry blanket, a good cloak, a living fire, a bowl of warm food, a neighbor's help, a roof that held, a child sleeping safely, an animal alive until spring. These were not minor blessings. They were the quiet architecture of survival. If one detail from this world stays with you, maybe let it be that first person rising in the dark. The room is cold. The others are still sleeping. The floor bites the feet. The air is smoky and sharp. Outside, the water waits, the animals wait, the road waits, and the whole day waits. But under the ash, there may still be a glow, and with careful hands, patient breath, and the knowledge passed down by countless mornings before, that glow can become flame again. If you were living in that world, what do you think would be hardest to endure? The cold room, the broken sleep, the damp clothing, or the knowledge that every bit of warmth had to be earned? Share your thoughts, and tell me what quietly fascinating part of history you would like to explore next. And if this kind of calm, detailed history is something you enjoy returning to, you're warmly invited to subscribe and join me again for another slow journey into the past.